Hey, it's been a while since we've been out and about, but we're down at the Olivia Museum. It's the military museum down in Red Wing. And we've contacted a Shane Kristen, and he's going to give us a little tour about the museum. He's a board member down here, and he's a docent. So he's a longtime volunteer here.
And I think there's probably almost every war that's represented in this museum.
So
We'll ask Shane just to make sure.
we'll have plenty to see. So we're going to ask him what he wants to show us first. So Shane, what are you going to show us first?
Well, I think today I'm going to give you the same spiel that I give to every guest that comes in here and has the audacity to ask questions. I think I'm going to start with a little bit about what the Olivia Military Museum is and some of our founders. The original museum was set up by a half a dozen collectors that we got tired of our wives and loved ones saying, "Get this out of my closet, attic, basement, etc." Pooled resources and pooled collections, and this is what you see. The majority of what we have are World War II GI bring homes. But we are nicely varied in that we have something from almost every military engagement the United States has been involved in. Our oldest verifiable items are in this case right here. We have a fascine knife, which would have been the tool of the combat engineers that dates back to the American Revolution. And it is our oldest verifiable item. And that we know exactly where it came from. It was dug at Fort Ticonderoga, the site of a Revolutionary War siege. Our oldest possible item would be the bronze short sword directly underneath it. I know exactly where it's been since the mid-1970s because I was with my mother when she purchased it. And I remember thinking, $20 for that? Do you have any idea how much candy and soda I could buy? Well, it's been in the family ever since, and I originally believed it to be a counterfeit or a forgery sold to tourists. And a couple of years ago, we were lucky enough to have some Chinese exchange teachers come through. And one of the teachers was kind enough to translate one side of the blade, which reads, "This sword defends my country." Then he turned the blade over and exclaimed, "You're going to have to find a scholar for this because it's old Chinese," which makes me believe it may well be the real thing. I'd like to hope so.
So this is that bronze Chinese sword that you heard Shane talking about. You can see the patina on it. It's really a nice looking sword, and it goes back to the Bronze Age. So that's the oldest thing, like he said, that's in this museum. I think that's really cool. But he's got some more information. He's going to talk to us about some knives next.
What you see there are 4 knives manufactured by the same company in Germany. The company started out before World War II manufacturing Hitler Youth knives. And the 4 knives you see there, the first 2 are wartime. The one on the far left is pre-war, and more care and time was taken in its manufacture. The one next to it is late war, and it shows that, manufacturing tolerances, they were trying to speed things up a bit, but they were still very high quality. As you move further to the right, you're going to notice that those are no longer Hitler Youth knives. In fact, after World War II, the company remained solvent by manufacturing Boy Scout knives. It was not uncommon in the 1950s and even up into the 1960s for that fleur-de-lis sticker of the Boy Scouts to peel away and there would be a swastika underneath. Now, right here, we have Mr. Bruce Sexton. Bruce spent 30 years in the United States Army. He enlisted in 1943 and he retired in 1970. The majority of edged weapons that are seen in the museum were part of his collection. He was a consummate pack rat. He did not throw things away, and by the end he had many duplicates of the same item. And those duplicates and being able to sell those off to raise funds for the museum have continued to support this museum long after he passed. Unfortunately, we lost him to cancer. Most GIs, when they come in and they see this uniform, will note and go, "Oh, that's a man who was a veteran of World War II." But then they'll see the combat infantry badge with 2 stars. And that is quite rare. This means this man saw combat in not 1, not 2, but 3 wars with a combat infantry unit. Every item has a story, and that is one of the wonders of history. This history is really nothing more than a collection of stories. Unfortunately, so many of the stories behind these artifacts is being lost. This particular knife, was owned by a man that I knew very well as a child. I delivered newspapers, and this was owned by the last man, by the last family on my paper route, and I would normally stop there and visit with them for a few minutes. I never really understood for the longest time why, whenever I saw this man outside of church, he was never wearing anything more than a pair of boxer shorts and a muscle shirt. The reason being is after World War II in the Pacific, he picked up a skin disease that made his skin incredibly sensitive. His wife's touch was painful. Despite this, anytime I ever saw him in church, he was wearing a full 3-piece suit with tie. Now, this knife was with this man through his entire naval career. Now, in the early and mid-1930s, he made his living as a clammer on the Mississippi River. He and a buddy would row out over the clam beds, and he would take a deep breath, jump over the side with a rake in one hand and a net bag in the other, and he would scoop up as many clams as he could. That fed his family through a large portion of the 1930s of the Great Depression. Unfortunately, by the late 1930s, that part of the river was completely clammed out. So he decided to join the Navy. That would help provide for him, his wife, and his young son. He was issued this knife fairly early in his career. And because of his incredibly good capabilities as a swimmer, and he could hold his breath for a very long time, he was made a Navy salvage diver. This knife was at several historic points in American history. This knife was at Pearl Harbor after the attack. His job was to swim out and see if they could locate survivors among the wreckage that was trapped in air pockets. He absolutely refused to speak of that, other than that was what he did. As far as he knew, he was one of the very first men ashore in North Africa, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, and the south of France. He also carried this blade across the Rhine into Germany. And his job when they swam ashore was to mark landing lanes. Now you can imagine a 12-year-old child who loved history. As soon as I heard the name Normandy, and I saw the other items on his mantelpiece, which included a German helmet, a Luger, and several other items, I had to know the story. And I pestered him for quite a while, and actually several weeks, before he finally relented and told the story. And as soon as he did, I was aghast, because the first thing he spoke about was not heroics or fear, it was cigarette smoke. He stated that he and his partner swam ashore at Normandy. They came up and onto the shore behind one of the anti-tank barriers, and they were removing their flippers and water gear so they could better do their job on the beach. And they both smelled cigarette smoke. The Germans smoked a very pungent tobacco that they'd picked up in Russia. And he figured the German patrol had marched out of sight of the officers, and they sat down on the other side of that anti-tank barrier, smoked cigarettes, BS'd, and wrote letters for several hours. By the time they stood up and walked away, the sun was almost up, and the bombardment began just a few minutes later. So that knife has been there and done that. But that was not the end of that knife. I've never been able to verify that his son may have carried it in Korea, but I believe he did. And when the gentleman passed, his wife sent me that knife as a thank you when I was in the United States Air Force, and I carried it through my Air Force career. And in an effort to continue that tradition, I passed it on to a young man who was at the time a member of the 3rd Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Reenactment Group, who was going into the Army. And Specialist Devin Volanek went ahead and carried that in his tour of Iraq. So that blade has been across 3 generations of people serving in the United States military. And that is the kind of story that every item's got, but unfortunately we've lost so many of those.
Now we're entering the Civil War room, and Shane's going to talk to us about a few items in this room also.
It's rare for us to have items that we know exactly who owned them and who may or may not have carried them during the Civil War. You see here a rifle owned by Private Charles Hackle. And if you were to look at the muster roll, you will see his name on that roll, and that at the time of Vicksburg they were carrying Whitney rifles. And this is a Whitney rifle, a model 1841 of the type that had been carried early war by members of the 4th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry. Here we have an officer's sword that was owned by Lieutenant William Seeley Grow. And he was with the 2nd Minnesota Volunteer Infantry, and he carried that in his service. And he would serve initially with the 2nd Minnesota and would return to Goodhue County and would become a politician and as well as the draft officer. He was a well-liked individual and very active in the community up through the time of his death in 1905. And finally, we have our most recent acquisition, and perhaps my absolute favorite. This model 1841 rifle was carried by a member of the 4th Minnesota, Corporal August Wishman. And we know this because he carved his initials on the inside of the patch box. And that was a requirement of some companies of the 4th Minnesota so that the weapons would remain accountable. It's an interesting item in that it's still fully functional. It will shoot quite well, and it had remained in the family until fairly recently. And I am very proud of the opportunity to have been able to pick this up. The Civil War is my passion, and it is also a passion of the man behind the camera.
So this is the World War I room. And there's quite a few little things here to showcase, but Shane's going to tell us about a few items in this case.
We have 2 items that I'd like to brag about a little bit. This very small matchbox was given as a gift to German soldiers by the Kaiser during the height of World War I for Christmas. It's a small gift, but at least it's something. Below it, you're going to see a German machine gun that was brought back as a souvenir by a man who would become a judge. It was apparently not uncommon for his children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren to load this onto a little red wagon and take it to school for show and tell day. Times have changed just a little bit. I'd like to show off this very recent acquisition for the museum to showcase some of the things that we have behind the scenes that we just don't have room to be able to display. This is a very unique item. This is a folio from a Belgian artist based in World War II. He used his art as a form of resistance against the Germans. And I'm just going to open up to one page. Much of his art can be considered rather disturbing because he was using art to show what the Germans were doing. One of his very first shows the harbingers of a new order, the German Luftwaffe, as they came in and bombed targets throughout Belgium. He would keep this folio through the entire war, and it was brought back to us by the wife of an American GI, Josie Bald Eagle. David himself had been a member of the 82nd Airborne, and he dropped into St. Mary-en-Glisse at Normandy. He was very badly wounded and would spend the rest of the war in the hospital. After the war, he would come home and keep on keeping on, as American soldiers are wont to do. He was an actor in multiple Hollywood movies. He was a very strong chief among the Lakota people of the Minikojuu on the Cheyenne River Reservation. Unfortunately, like so many other veterans, we lost him fairly recently.
Well, we'd like to thank Shane for giving us a tour through the Alivio Museum. Thank you, Shane.
All I'm going to say is that we'll be open as soon as the governor lets us, and we are normally open on Fridays and Saturdays from 10 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, and we're also available for private tours if you have enough warning. I'd love to share this museum with anybody who's interested.